Hey.
Hi.
You know Sonic the Hedgehog?
To say that the new Scott Pilgrim anime is divisive would be selling it short. You can see all types of opinions about the show on the internet, ranging from the utmost positive to the very far negative. As for where I stand, well, on the positive side of course, as you can tell by the title. And now, I just want to gush about this show, and why I love it so much in spite of its reception amongst the internet. So, this video is just going to be my pure and unfiltered thoughts on the show, how I feel when watching it for the first time with barely any Scott Pilgrim knowledge whatsoever, and how I feel when watching it the second time after going back to watch the movie and read the graphic novels. And so, this is my take on Scott Pilgrim Takes Off.
We are Sex Bomb! 1, 2, 3, 4! Hey! 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 Hey!
Watching this show as an entry to the franchise is kinda surreal because I'm basically watching an alternate scenario of a story without viewing the original story first. A lot of the jokes that reference the comics, and especially the movie, just flew over my head. I mean, at the very least, I still have passing knowledge of the story and the basic premise, so I'm not going in completely blind, and not having prior knowledge doesn't make the twist in the first episode less shocking. In fact, considering how a lot of the divisive opinion came from the comparison with the comics, watching this first kinda made it easier for me to appreciate it for what it is, as I had no expectations going in, and was just in for the ride. However, I would still recommend that people at least watch the movie before going into this, as a lot of the enjoyment does come from noticing how the story differs and seeing different sides of familiar characters. But let's just get into the show already now. Before that though, spoiler alert for the entire show, as it's basically impossible to talk about this show for even just a little bit without even spoiling a major part of it. So, if you haven't watched it, I suggest clicking off and go watch it, I guess. So, let's just head into the big twist already. Scott Pilgrim dies in the first fight with Matthew Patel. Well, he's not actually dead, but he's kidnapped and absent for the majority of the show. So now the show is centered around Ramona trying to find out who kidnapped Scott and reconciling with her exes in the process. Honestly, I like this premise. Like, just looking back at the comics, the evil exes were always the one who got the least development, as they're more so just boss fights for Scott to defeat. And we never really got to dive as much into Ramona's flaws as much as Scott, when they're both really flawed people in their own rights. So, if in the comics we get a lot of development for Scott and his exes, now it's Ramona's and her exes' turn. You might even say that it's... The second episode mainly focuses on Matthew fighting Gideon for the throne of his empire because of the self-confidence boost he gains by defeating Scott, and how the characters all react to Scott's apparent death by having the episode start with his funeral, which then contains a performance by Ed B. Frickin' Adams. This is just how the world of Scott Pilgrim works, guys. Don't question it. And by episode 3, the gears are fully set, and the next few episodes are mainly going to be focusing on Ramona's quest to find Scott while facing off against her exes along the way. If the original story was like a video game and all of the evil exes are like boss fights, then this is like a game where you have side quests to give therapy sessions to some NPCs, except that the side quests are mandatory and the NPCs are very important characters throughout the story. Okay, looking back, that analogy makes no sense, but screw it, I'm gonna just keep it in. The extra character development for some of the exes here are really great. Despite not facing off with Ramona, Matthew's whole arc about stealing Gideon's empire, only to realize that he hates being a CEO and just wants to fulfill his dream of being a Broadway musical star is really cute. Gideon, I feel, is also great here. I really like how he's made out to be a bit more sympathetic here as we get to learn a bit more from his past, but they also never undermine the absolutely horrible stuff that he's done.
When I was with him, Gideon, Gordon, was a twitchy, rage-filled, impulsive, emotionally abusive, controlling, manipulative egomaniac.
Also, him getting together with Julie just makes so much sense because of how toxic they both are, so I really enjoy the pairing here, and how they can just be evil together. However, I think the one that got the most improvement here is Roxy, and from what I've seen, yeah, most people kinda agree on that. Ramona has always been dismissive of her exes, but I think that it's felt the most whenever she talks about Roxy.
You and her?
It was just a phase.
Just a phase?
You had a sexy face?
It meant nothing. I didn't think it would count.
It meant nothing?
See, always dismissing her of just being her college roommate or it being just a phase, when this relationship could have meant so much more to Roxy. So it's nice to see that this aspect of their relationship is finally getting tackled here, with an amazing fight scene to boot no less, where they're moving from movie to movie in the no-account video store. Again, this is the world of Scott Pilgrim, so just don't question it. The scene where Roxy and Ramona finally start talking it out, and then Ramona finally apologizes for what she's done, feels so real. It really highlights how Roxy, or rather most of the exes, aren't actually evil. They just need closure from what Ramona has done to them. I mean, let's face it, from leaving Lucas immediately when she's met Todd, leaving Roxy without even saying a word, and then dating both of the twins at the same time without the other one knowing, it's just like I said earlier. Just like Scott, she's done some horrible stuff as well. Now, Roxy may be the one that got the most improvement here, and therefore my favorite ex as well, but I think another one that really got his time to shine here is Lucas Lee. He's always been one of the chiller exes, especially in the comics where he's really just a chill dude. Although the Lucas Lee here is basically the one from the movie, which yeah, I'm fine with. But anyways, I like how we get to see more of Lucas doing his thing, like skateboarding or acting. He doesn't really get much development here compared to Roxy, I suppose, but I just love it whenever he's on screen. Him being too reckless and eventually kinda destroying his own acting career is something very believable. And then after that, him being bros with Gideon is also really cool as well. If there's an evil ex that I think is a bit underwhelming here though, it's definitely Todd. Well, and the twins, but they're kinda always in the background that it's kind of a joke at this point. But anyways, we get an entire episode with Todd and Envy, but I feel like it doesn't really add anything to any of their characters. Todd discovering that he likes men and falling in love with Wallace, only to immediately get dumped and be told that
When the movie ends, so does the relationship. Tale as old as time.
it's hilarious, I'll admit. Other than that though, Todd is just the same cheating and arrogant jerk that he's always been. If this was the case, I would have at least appreciated if they did something with Envy, but no. Honestly, episode 5 as a whole, while still being really good and hilarious, is probably my least favorite episode of the show. It's funny as heck, don't get me wrong, but it kinda grinds the show to a halt when it was at a pretty good pace before this, so yeah. That's pretty much all I have to say about the 7 evil exes though, but that begs the question, how is Ramona as a main character here? Well, simply put, she's amazing here, as expected from the fact that she's the main character here. This version of Ramona is the best that she's ever been written. Her arc here is similar to that of Scott in the comics, that being learning to confront her past and becoming a better person from doing so. However, she takes a more involved approach here, like with confronting all of the evil exes, for example, since unlike Scott, she's not an idiot who is unaware of how her actions affect others. In the movie, Ramona is kind of an odd character. Everyone there kind of got sidelined in favor of Scott, which makes sense since they had a very limited runtime with that. So I get them wanting to just focus on Scott, but that does leave a lot of the characters feeling shallow. And I feel like the one who suffers the most here is Ramona, the one who's supposed to be the main love interest, but ends up just feeling like a trophy to be won at the end. One of the most common complaints about the movie is that they have no chemistry together. They just go on a random date and then start making out, even though Ramona has shown absolutely no interest in Scott whatsoever. And I can't even begin to understand why he would fall for Ramona here. In the comics, it definitely made sense and they definitely have chemistry together, but in the movie, I'm sorry, but I just don't see it. By contrast, I completely understand why Scott and Ramona would fall for each other here. One of the great things about retelling the story of how Scott and Ramona met, aka the first volume of the comic here, is how they can change some seemingly minor stuff, but in hindsight can actually change a lot on how I view these characters. Since the story is about Ramona trying to find Scott, they have to sell their chemistry if they want to make the story work, and man, they did it really well here. Here are several of the changes that I noticed that really impacted my view of their chemistry. When Scott asked her out, he didn't awkwardly force her to do so. Ramona genuinely seems interested and even smiles because of it. During their semi-date, Ramona just seems so much more easygoing and just more invested in the conversation compared to the movie. Before they make out, Ramona didn't mention the tea before they both go to bed, which I think is a good decision if they want to show that she is into Scott, since the tea line always felt like a lame excuse to get out of bed. And finally, in both the movie and the comic, it was Ramona who first said that she doesn't want to have sex with Scott yet, whereas in this show, Scott is actually the one who said that he's not ready before Ramona continues on with her line.
I changed my mind.
From what? To what?
I don't want to have sex with you, Pilgrim. Not right now.
These might seem like subtle changes at first, but they really did impact a lot of my view of their chemistry, which is why I was completely on board when Ramona tried to look for Scott with no hesitation. If this was the movie Ramona, no way would I have bought her trying to look for Scott after just one date. But these changes just make the plot feel more natural, and more than that, it just makes Ramona far more likable. It makes her feel more human. Aside from the changes made in the first episode, throughout the whole show, we get to see who Ramona is as a person outside of her relationship with Scott. We get to see her interact with the people in Toronto. We can see her actually emote here, like smiling, laughing, and blushing when Kim mentions Scott, or being a bit awkward. We see her develop an interest in stunt work after being Envy's stunt double. Little things like this are what makes Ramona so likable for me. It's the first time that we get to explore this side of her. The comics sorta dive into it a little bit, but it's always from Scott's perspective most of the time, so it's just so nice to actually see her in action here. Honestly, I think Ramona makes for as great of a main character as Scott did for the comics. I still have a bit more to say regarding her character arc, but that's for say for when we talk about the finale of the show. In the meantime, let's see what the others are up to. Now, unfortunately, not everyone gets equal attention here. For example, Kim, I feel, is one of the characters that got a bit sidelined, but I also don't mind it that much considering that she was one of the characters that got more focused in the comics. I still enjoy her inclusion in the show nonetheless. Young Neil becoming a movie writer I think was hilarious. Envy Adams also got a bit sidetracked, but again, just like Kim, she also got more focus in the comics, so I don't mind it that much. And besides, she did have an amazing music performance at Scott's funeral. But the sole reason why I decided to write this section in the first place is the new direction of Nice's character here. Before, her whole character was built on the fact that she was a teenage girl who Scott dated and then dumped, and then because of that, she developed an unhealthy obsession with him. A huge part of her character was the fact that she couldn't get over Scott. Scott never viewed their relationship as something important, but he was more so using her just so he could get over his breakup with Envy. But Knives, being a young and naive girl who's never even had a relationship before, of course, really valued this relationship, and because of that, developed a really unhealthy obsession with Scott, and an honestly unjustified hatred for Ramona. Her character arc in the comics is one that we can talk about more in another video. The point is, though, that her character arc revolves around Scott's awful actions, so then that presents an interesting question. What will she do if you take Scott out of the picture, and now she has no other option but to move on? Well, at first, she does the same thing of projecting unjustified hatred on Ramona by claiming that she was the reason that Scott died, when no, it was Matthew Patel. But then, because she had no other option but to move on, she tried to channel her emotions into something else. And this is when she finds out that she's kind of super talented in music. She learns to play both bass and piano in just about 4 hours respectively. She then continues to develop her talent in the form of songwriting, and along with Steven Stills, write an entire musical based on Young Neil's cancelled movie, which was based on what would have happened if Scott won the fight against Matthew Patel, which is basically the movie that we got. Can I just say that I love all the callbacks to the movie here? Anyways, yeah, I just really enjoy how this show explores a new, never before seen side of Knives. Seeing her develop a friendship with Steven, who was always the most serious member of Sex Bomb, as Kim and Scott are mostly only there for the fun of it. But yeah, I guess that's all I have to say about the side characters. Alright, what else is there to talk about before the finale? Oh yeah!
We are Sex Bomb! 1, 2, 3, 4!
In your orange shirt, we'll go for yoga. Wish I could paint you all.
In terms of the presentation here, this anime is like the perfect combination of everything Scott Pilgrim. The art style is mainly inspired by the comics, the cast reprising their roles from the movie, and the music being done by Anamanaguchi, just like in the game. Simply put, I think the animation here is beautiful. Like, I just love looking at this show. I think the character designs are beautiful, the animation is buttery smooth, especially in the fight scenes, and yeah, overall, this show is an absolute eye candy. The OST here is great, as usual with a lot of Anamanaguchi's work. If you love retro game music or something in the same style, I would heavily recommend their work. They mix a lot of chiptune sound with more conventional instruments together, and they sound amazing and mix together so well. The voice acting of the show is also great, surprise surprise. I think my favorite performances would be Satya Baba as Matthew Patel, I hope I pronounced that correctly, Jason Schwartzman as Gideon Graves, and Mae Whitman as Roxy Richter. Satya Baba completely nails it as Matthew here. His performance goes a long way in making this goofball just so likable. Jason Schwartzman does a very different take on Gideon compared to his movie counterpart, and yet he absolutely nails it. And finally, we have Mae Whitman, who is also the actress that I'm the most familiar with, as she played Emily Blight in The Owl House. I should really follow up on that season 1 video, don't I? But yeah, she's amazing as Roxy here. She did a great job at highlighting Roxy's emotion during that fight scene, while also being great when she's being more goofy as well. Alright, is that it? I think that's it. Alright, let's talk about the last 2 episodes here.
Konya wa hurricane, anata ni hurricane, sutai tai no loving you.
So, it turns out that Scott wasn't kidnapped by any of Ramona's exes, he was instead kidnapped by older Scott, the future version of himself. This Scott here is the one that has actually fought and defeated all of the 7 evil exes and married Ramona. However, older Scott claims that they had a divorce, which we later learn isn't the case, the relationship is just having a rough patch now, but instead of trying to fix the problem, he decides to go through all of this hoop to time travel through time so that past him wouldn't date Ramona. I don't think I need to explain why that's screwed up, it kinda speaks for itself. Scott obviously isn't too happy about this, so he meets up with future Ramona and with her help, goes back to the past. Honestly, I really like the idea that Scott and Ramona sometime in the future has a problem with their relationship, and instead of trying to fix it, just goes back to old habits. Especially since this older Scott never had his negative Scott moment like in the comic. And then later on in the next episode, which is of course the final one, we get to see even older Scott basically becoming Ramona's 8th evil ex after training for 10 years because of his unhealthy obsession with Ramona, yet his refusal to even try to talk to her. And it's not like Ramona is getting off free of blame here as well. Like, yeah, Scott is definitely the one who's handling the situation worse, but that doesn't make how she handles it suddenly good. Honestly, I think older Scott and future Ramona here are great ways to kind of mirror the current Scott and Ramona to highlight both of them what they will become if they refuse to change. Older Scott here is kind of like the negative Scott from the comics. There, Scott tries to fight negative Scott, and by doing so, he's trying to forget all of his past mistakes. That is, until he realizes that he can't just keep forgetting his past and repeating all of his mistakes again, as doing that will only make him hurt even more people. Scott's arc was about facing off with himself and him trying to accept the mistakes that he's made in the past, because only then would he be able to improve on himself for the future. Despite Scott not really being there for the majority of the show, his presence can definitely be felt throughout the entirety of it, and I think he still has a complete and satisfying arc here. By giving him the future version of himself that he doesn't want to become, it gives him a push to start changing and improving himself. Granted, this isn't as in-depth of a character journey as in the comics, but I still appreciate the attempt at still giving him a character arc while trying to focus more on the other characters here. Plus, I just love how we get to see a Scott that never really had his negative Scott moment per se, or never earns the power or self-respect, or anything like that. We see what would happen if he just keeps repeating past mistakes instead of trying to learn from them. On a similar note, this applies to Ramona as well here. When the relationship hits a rough patch, Ramona just decides to go back to old habits and just runs away from Scott and doesn't even try to contact him afterwards. So I feel like they can both be blamed here, even if I guess Scott's reaction is a bit more overblown. And that's how it's always been in other Scott Pilgrim stories as well, hasn't it? It's a story about 2 flawed people finding comfort in each other and then trying to fight for each other. Whenever they have a conflict, that's almost always the fault of both of them failing to communicate with one another. And this is exactly that, just on a bigger scale. Speaking of Ramona though, I feel like it's appropriate to end off the talk about the finale of this show by seeing how Ramona's arc is wrapped up. After seeing how Scott will become in the future, Ramona starts to doubt on whether or not she actually wants to date Scott. However, that's when it hits her that if she just runs away from Scott, she'll just keep repeating the same mistakes again and again. The reason that she went on this investigation journey to begin with isn't because she magically falls in love with Scott after just one date. It's because they had chemistry together. They had sparks. It's because she wants to find out if he truly is the love of her life. So now she's done running away. Even after seeing how Scott can possibly end up in the future, she still chooses to take a chance with him and see for herself how they will will end up. And at the end, just like in the comics and the movie, Scott and Ramona are both gonna see this through for themselves. Now with the added warning of how they will become in the future if they don't start taking care of themselves. And after this, we get to see an epilogue of how the other characters end up, which is honestly just so wholesome. And then they ended off with Ramona dyeing her hair again, of course, and then we see her and the main gang together as they play the song Scott Pilgrim by Plumtree, which is the main inspiration for the creation of this Scott Pilgrim. Man, what a way to go out. Overall, I think the ending is great. It manages to give Scott a satisfying arc in spite of him taking less of a focus this time. It gives most of the characters a satisfying payoff, like bro, I didn't even talk about the musical, did I? Steven and I are winning so hard right now, I swear. And my boy Matthew was taking a huge W as well. And most importantly, of course, it gives Ramona the satisfying conclusion she deserves. Honestly, I'd go as far to say that this is the best Scott Pilgrim ending out of all of them. The comics ending is pretty great, although the stuff with the glow is a bit too convoluted and messy for my liking. And the movie is also kind of a mess in my opinion, due to it feeling very rushed, but this is pretty much as best as a send-off that I can possibly ask for. If this is the last Scott Pilgrim thing ever, then I'm glad to say that they end off on a high note. I'm so grateful for the fact that this show exists. If it wasn't for this show, I probably wouldn't have gotten into Scott Pilgrim at all. And thanks to it, we get to see a lot of familiar characters in a whole new light. Most importantly, of course, it finally gives Ramona the spotlight that she deserves. She's an amazing main character here, so yeah. Overall, if you can already tell, I absolutely love this show. It has become one of my favorite shows of all time, just like how the comic is now my favorite comic of all time. But we can get to that at a later date. As a lot of people have said, it is a great antidote to the modern reboot culture. They could have just told the same story all over again, but they chose to do something new with it, and they do it with so much passion and love and respect for the original work. It has similar themes to the original and understands clearly what makes it so special, while being brave enough to do something new with it, instead of doing the same thing over again. And you know, an opportunity like this doesn't come too often. Heck, this might even be just a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. So, it makes sense why Brian Lee O'Malley wanted to do something new with it, instead of just retelling the exact same story for the third time. And the new story that they tell is one that has stuck to many audiences, new and old. It brings so much new to the Scott Pilgrim world. It dared to be something new. It dared to surprise people. And I'm glad to say that it truly took off.